global economy, and also have the pleasure of overseeing the Wilson Center on the Hill program. Let me point out David Klaus, who just sat down, and Liz Byers, who's in the back there. She and David really are the muscle and the brains behind the Wilson Center on the Hill. I want to extend a special thanks to the Hewlett Foundation that has funded these programs. Their focus really has been on trade and development, sustainable development in the emerging markets and in the developing countries. And what would U.S. concern about old age retirement? Well, one of the things that's happened, for instance, is that the flow of foreign direct investment into the developing world has changed dramatically, slowed dramatically as a result of the global financial crisis, which of course has rippled through retirement funds as well as other kinds of financial assets. Let me remind you that we have some future events coming up. On July 16th, we're going to have 3 experts really on European education. We're going to talk about that PISA test in which the U.S. has come in about 20th, and they're going to suggest some lessons that we might apply to U.S. education going forward. And on July 28th, we're going to look at the two potentially emerging nuclear states, Iraq and Iran. So you might want to put the 16th and the 28th on your must-come calendars. And let me remind you that on the table there are cards. If you would like to fill them out, we can get you some added information about the different programs at the Wilson Center. Well, now it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event, Sonya Michel, sitting here in the moderator's place in the middle. Sonya has just come to the Wilson Center to head up our Division of United States Studies. We lured her away from the University of Maryland, where she has been a history professor, focusing on studies on men, women, gender studies, you might say, but also looking at this question of retirement. She is now working on yet another book entitled Old Age Insecurity. So we'll all look forward to that. There's a bit of a bio of Sonya out on the table as you came in. It will remind you that she's taught at one prestigious place after another: Brown, Harvard, Brandeis, Princeton, University of Illinois. She has been a peripatetic professor and clearly in demand. Lots of books and articles. So if you want to continue this subject of retirement and where we are and where we're going, why, she's a marvelous source. Sonya, let me turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Kent, for that very kind introduction. It's introductions like that make you understand why it's such a pleasure to be able to work at the Wilson Center. And another wonderful reason to be able to work at the Wilson Center is to be able to participate in events like this, to have the opportunity to bring scholars like the people and experts like the people we have on the panel today to talk to you about important current events. And that, of course, is the mission of the Wilson Center, to bring scholars and policymakers together. So we're really delighted to have all of you here to talk about a very important topic, retirement and retirement security. And the title of our panel is, as you know, Scrambled Nest Eggs, the Financial Crisis and Federal Retirement Policy. So let me just give you a brief introduction to the topic and then a brief introduction to our speakers, and then I'll turn it over to them. What does the current financial crisis have to do with federal retirement policy? Kent just gave you one dimension of it. Another one is, of course, it has many ramifications, as we're about to hear. When many Americans think about the federal role in retirement, they think only of Social Security. But Social Security, as the cliche goes, is but one leg of a 3-legged stool. And when the other legs of that stool, namely occupational or employment-based retirement plans and personal savings and other assets, when those begin to wobble, the whole stool is at risk of falling. With the recession, key elements of this public-private system of retirement have become severely weakened, threatening the financial security of many retirees and near retirees. Because both public and private old age provision are regulated by federal law, Congress can play a critical role today, as it has in the past, in shoring up retirement security by taking a close look and a critical look at the legislation currently in place and deciding what, if any, reforms are needed. Since the New Deal, when Social Security came into being, the tripartite system of retirement has become increasingly complicated. Over the years, Social Security itself, initially targeted at retired workers, was expanded to include their spouses and survivors. Occupational plans, first based on defined benefits, have since the passage of ERISA in 1974 increasingly shifted to the defined contribution type. And for many Americans, personal assets have made a marked shift from savings accounts and bonds to more speculative vehicles like houses, stocks, and mutual funds. Our two speakers today are well qualified to help us sort through these developments and to understand their implications for retirement security. You have their bios in front of you, but just let me, something just happened to the mic. You have their bios in front of you, but just let me introduce them briefly. I think we just lost the, no? Okay. John Gist, to my right, is a private consultant and former senior advisor for economic and fiscal affairs at the AARP Public Policy Institute. And he's going to report to us today on an important study he's just completed, which is entitled Refinancing and Housing Wealth Effects, Impacts on Consumption and Household Balance Sheets, 1989 to 2007. In particular, John will discuss how refinancing and equity withdrawal have affected the finances of pre-retirees now that the post-2006 plunge in housing values has left many homeowners much more highly leveraged than they had anticipated or desired. Our second speaker, Heidi Hartmann, is president of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and she has long been concerned with women's economic security in general, with special attention to the differential impact of retirement and other benefits on women and men. She will discuss the changing economic roles of women and how their experiences of retirement are changing as a result, with reference to the baby boomer generation and baby boomer women. She'll also take a look at how women and men access retirement income, pensions, Social Security, and savings, thus bringing us back to the three-legged stool. After our scholars have presented their remarks, we'll open the floor to your questions and comments. Since we're on the Hill, we're going to ask congressional staff to go first, and then others will follow, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So please welcome our first speaker, John Gist.
Thank you very much, Sonya. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. I think you have handouts at your places there, at least I hope you do, that you'll sort of need to follow along, especially when I get to the second half of my remarks. Let me start out by saying that the housing boom that we experienced in the late 1990s that ended in about 2006 has often been credited with spurring the consumer demand at an important time when the economy was reeling from the effects of the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. and the recession. How did that housing boom affect consumer demand? The chief way that it worked was that homeowners extracted home equity from houses that were rapidly appreciating in value. During the housing boom, which I mentioned the period of time over which this occurred, but it really accelerated after 2000, equity extracted from homes averaged about $1 trillion per year between 2001 and 2005. It had been averaging about $300 billion per year from 1991 to 2000. So it really increased. The incidence of refinancing and extraction of equity increased after 2000. Roughly two-thirds of all the equity that was extracted from 1991 to 2005 was in the form of the sale of existing homes, and the use of the equity in general from those sales would be put back into the house that was being purchased. So it was reinvested essentially. About 20% of the equity extraction was from home equity loans and lines of credit, and about 13% came in the form of cash-out refinancing, where people refinanced homes, took out some of their equity. And that withdrawn equity gets spent somehow. So one of the key unresolved economic issues is how big that effect was. And economists talk about the wealth effect, which is basically the increase in consumer spending, personal consumption expenditures, which results from an increase in personal wealth. Both income and wealth increase our consumption, and there's quite a bit of literature on how large that effect is with respect to wealth. When it comes to the studies that have been done on this suggest that wealth effect ranges anywhere from about 1%, which is quite small, to about 15, or in some cases even larger than that. In other words, for every dollar of wealth that a household realizes, increased wealth, it would spend anywhere from a penny up to 15 or perhaps more cents per dollar. So there have been quite a few estimates, and the estimates vary, but I would say that they bunch around single digits, somewhere like 5 to 7% of wealth increases is ultimately spent. There's some degree of consensus on the fact that the effect of housing wealth seems to be greater than the effect of increases in other forms of wealth, that is, the effect that housing appreciation has on consumption. So that the housing wealth effects have been estimated to be anywhere between 5 and 10%, depending on the study. So one question that we try to answer is, how big is that effect? But there are some other unresolved questions in the literature, one of which is, how did this extraction of home equity vary according to the age of the household? And we were looking at this in terms of birth cohorts, that is, what are large aggregates of the population, but divided by the year in which they were born. Because we were particularly interested in studying baby boomers, because there's been a lot written about their retirement preparation. Many of them happen to be on the verge of retirement, or in some cases in retirement. So we divided up our sample, which is a Federal Reserve survey, the Survey of Consumer Finances, into 4 large aggregates. What we call pre-boomers, who are people born before 1946, early boomers, who are born between 1946 and 1955, late boomers born between 1956 and 1964, and then post-boomers, which is all households born after 1964. And in the handout that you have, the very first table, which the tables are not numbered 1 through X. They're numbered. They're numbered in order, but not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's table 2, shows you the breakdown of those households over the course of the study, and you can see that pre-boomers, which is the oldest cohort, is about half of the total number of households at the beginning of the period, but it actually shrinks down to about a third by the end. Whereas post-boomers don't even exist in our study in 1989 because none of them was old enough. The household head was not old enough to be included, because we only included household heads aged 25 and older. Now I'm already seeing that I'm taking too much time because we've been given a strict time limit. So I'm going to zoom right ahead and try to talk about, here are the questions that we tried to answer, and then try to present the results. We wanted to know how many people refinanced, and of course by these various birth cohorts, how much did they take out? How much did they cash out when they refinanced? What did they use the money for? And what consequences of using that money for the purposes for which they used it? What consequences did that have for their household balance sheets and presumably their retirement preparation? So the first page of that handout has two graphs which show you who refinanced or how many people refinanced and who took out cash when they refinanced. The first shows that, roughly speaking, across all households, about 30 to 35% of households refinanced from 95 to 2001. And then in 2004 and 2007, it shot up to about 45% on average. And early and late boomers had the highest percentages of refinancing, over about 50% over that period of the 2004 to 2007 period. And you can see how the cohorts differ. But the older cohorts tended to refinance more. The second chart there, Figure 2, shows you the percentages of those who refinanced, what percent also took money out, took cash out. And here, we had expected that the oldest or older cohorts, especially those in let's say in their 50s or, well, throughout their 50s, even into early 60s, would be more likely to take equity, to take cash out. And it turns out that the oldest cohort, the pre-boomers, in 1998 and 2001 had by far the highest percentage of cash out, people taking cash out of their equity. Between 60 and 70% did so of the refinancers. By 2004 and 2007, boomers were, actually all four age groups were approximately equal in terms of the percentage taking cash out, between 40 and 50%. So who were these people? I mean, who was it that refinanced and also who took cash out? The next table in the handout gives you an idea by sort of comparing various demographic and financial characteristics of refinancers versus non-refinancers, and those who took cash out versus those who didn't. To make a long story short, refinancers were more likely to have college degrees. They had higher income. They had higher net worth. They had higher home equity. They had higher home value appreciation since the home was purchased, and they also had more debt than those that didn't refinance. So then if you look at the other side of that table, the differences between those who cashed out and those who didn't, the differences are roughly follow the same pattern that you see with the refinancers. They're not quite as large. The differences are not quite as large, but essentially those who took cash out had more net worth. They had more home equity, and it gives you some racial and marital status and age differences. And none of those were terribly pronounced. So our next question was, how much did they take out? And here, let me just say, right now I'm talking about for those who were refinancing first mortgages only, because there are other ways in which people could extract equity from their home, like home equity lines of credit, but right now I'm only talking about first mortgages. And I neglected to include a table in there, but I'll just tell you what the numbers came out to. Roughly $40,000 was the mean. If you look at the third graph in the handout, that gives you an idea of how these withdrawals were distributed, and the roughly 45% of the amounts that people took out fell between $10,000 and $30,000. Now, it's hard to evaluate, I guess, how large that is, except that when previous studies that had been done by the Federal Reserve back around 2000 or 2002 looked at cash-out refinancing, they found that the amounts were much more modest. I mean, like 40% of the cash-outs were under $10,000. We found that less than 10% were under $10,000. There was a much more significant number or percentage of amounts taken out that were above $30,000. So it gives you an idea, comparing our work to the studies that were done a few years ago, gives you an idea how much appreciation there was in home values during the 2000 to 2007 period. Okay, I've got to wind up, so I better get to the bottom line of this quickly. You'll find basically the same result when you accept larger dollar amounts. When we do look at all extractions, not just first mortgage refinancing, but we look at home equity loans, home equity lines of credit. Those are listed on this table 11A, B, and C, which is also in your handout. The dollar amounts are in table 11C. But the other point one of the important points here, the most important point in a way, is how these are distributed by use, because we wanted to know how did people use the money. And whether we're looking at first mortgages or looking at all extractions, including home equity lines of credit, the single most frequent use and the most dollars were devoted to home purchase or repair. Second most frequent use or dollars spent were for debt consolidation, and then followed by consumption and investment. And sort of the bottom line of all this is that in terms of dollars spent, when we looked at all extractions, including first mortgages, second, third mortgages, home equity lines of credit, consumption was about 9 to 10% of all the dollars that were spent out of extracted equity. Now, there's one caveat which I must mention, which is that the debt consolidation category, which is a pretty sizable one, is one that the Federal Reserve has created, and it's actually a hybrid. It's got some consumption items in it. It has debt consolidation in it, and we could not separate the pure consumption from we couldn't separate the consumption from the debt consolidation portion of it. I'm convinced that the debt consolidation portion of it is the lion's share of the total, because previous studies have consistently found that debt consolidation was a very high frequency use of extracted home equity dollars. So what we conclude from this in terms of what people consume out of their home equity is shown in table 12, first of all. When you look at what I call pure consumption, which is when people said that they used the money for things that the Fed regarded as consumption, roughly 100 billion, this is across the whole population now. You can see it divided by birth cohort here. I'm just going to give you the top line results. Roughly 100 billion was consumed out of an increase in equity. This is between 2004 and 2007, out of an increase in home value of about 1.8 trillion. So people took out 100 billion out of 1.8 trillion, and they spent that on consumption. That amounts to a wealth effect of about 5.7%, which is completely consistent with other studies' results. If you took the debt consolidation category and arbitrarily said, let's count half of that as consumption, you would get that number up to 13.6, which is the last column of table 12. I am highly dubious about that. That's just an arbitrary number because we didn't know how to treat the debt consolidation category. I think the real number would be much lower than that. So if the wealth effect is 5.7% of income, then we move to table 13, which says how does that extraction and that amount, the amount that's spent on consumption, how does that relate to people's overall net worth? And how much did they consume out of their, how much did that subtract from their net worth? And in the last two columns, you get an idea that pure consumption as a percentage of net worth that was taken out of extracted home equity is less than 1% for the total population. If you just use the pure consumption category, if you count debt consolidation as half consumption and half debt consolidation, it still only reaches 1.7%. And the group that is the group that has the highest impact in terms of the amount of their net worth that is consumed is the youngest group, the post-boomers, who have, in the last column there, it's 2.9%. So the impact on their net worth is the greatest of the four birth cohorts. And finally, table 14 sort of puts this in the context of what was happening, what has happened to housing after the third quarter of 2006. Well, actually, in this case, we're looking at what happened to housing after the point at which the data that we were using was collected, and then up until the first quarter of 2009. the survey data we were using was collected in approximately the third quarter of 2007. So we looked at the change in housing values across the country. The Case-Shiller Index is the standard indicator that's used here. Housing lost 27.5% of its value across the country in that period. And so if you look at what happened to housing values relative to what people did on their own, they have the amount that they've lost just in the depreciation of housing values is anywhere between 10 and 20 times the amount that they took out of their own home equity, out of their own net worth. So the bottom line here is that by and large, people did sensible things with the money that they extracted from their home equity, from the appreciation in their home values, and relative to what happened to their net worth. And you know, this is the significant story, is how much they've lost basically in the housing market relative to what they've done to themselves, essentially. And that's the bottom line. Thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Thank you, John. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Wilson Center. And nice to see everybody, including some old friends. And I don't know, is this really working? Yeah. It is? Okay, great. I guess I want to broaden out the conversation a little bit and give you more of an overview of what's going on for older people, especially those 65 and over. And I have a few documents which I want to make sure that you have. One looks something like this, and the other two are at my desk, and I need them. Right here. And one looks something like this, and the other looks like this. So if you need any of the IWPR papers, we can get them for you. Raise your hand. And Ashley, could you help get some papers for this guy? I think there's just one person who needs them. Two?
Couple.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
No,
okay, 8,
more.
9. All right, well, here comes...
If you wait, it keeps growing. Liz?
Liz. Here comes Liz. She has them too. So Liz and Ashley can hand them out to you. Okay. So with that little introduction, let me just say, obviously, older Americans today have really suffered a triple whammy. You've just seen the facts that they've lost $3 trillion in home equity. Not all, that's all Americans. So older Americans have lost a share of that. And home ownership is quite high in the United States. When you compare home ownership among 65 and over in the U.S. to other countries, we actually rank fairly high on that. So I think home equity is a large source of the wealth of retirees. And although we don't see much of an effect on consumption, it does have an effect, especially as you get older. You may really think about selling your house and moving to a smaller place and using that profit that you would have been able to count on before to live on. So that's evaporating for today's retiring generation, the ability to sell that house at a huge profit and use it to subsidize their retirement income. Stock market, I don't have a figure similar to the $3 trillion, but many people's portfolios have fallen in value about 25%, some as much as 50%, all dependent on what you invested in. So one of the things that's happening in retirement, of course, most of you, I hope, know this. I see there are a lot of young people here. You may not have paid much attention to your pension yet, but pensions have moved for most people in America from defined benefit, which meant if you put in the time and you worked a certain number of years with your employer, you got a guaranteed retirement amount. Pensions have moved from that type of thing to a 401k type of thing, which is called a defined contribution. It depends on what you put in, what your employer put in, if anything, and how that investment portfolio did for you. So that has taken a hit because of the market. And a third big source of income for people, even in retirement, is employment. And now that we're in a major recession, the largest one almost since the Depression, depending on how you measure it, the ability to send yourself into the labor market to pick up some extra income when you see your housing equity is down, you see your retirement portfolio is down, that too does not exist in a recession. Very difficult to do. To just go out there and pick up some extra hours of employment or go back into the labor market. Now, interestingly, this is something that older Americans have been doing, and I haven't had a chance to check the recent release on July 2nd, but the one before, the monthly release from BLS every month on employment and unemployment data, showed that as of April, older women were the only group for whom a larger number of them was employed in April 2009 than were employed at the start of the recession. So older women have been able to move into the labor force and increase their employment. Employment for every other group has gone down. Now, labor force participation for older men has also gone up. They're looking for work. Their employment did go up during the recession, but I don't think it quite got to the pre-recession level yet, and it's probably fallen off again. But they're looking. So definitely older people are responding to this triple whammy of the home equity crisis, the stock market crisis, and the recession in general by trying to work more as they enter retirement or are already in retirement. So I would like you to take a look now at the briefing paper, The Economic Security of Older Women and Men, and just take a look at Table 2, and we can see what the main sources of income are for the people who are over 65 as of a couple of years ago. This was actually an average of 3 years of data from the current population survey, so this was actually before the current recession. You pretty much have to look at a number of years of the current population survey together to get enough data to look at African Americans, Hispanic, Asian Americans, and whites separately by women and men, and we also look at them by marital status and some other things later on. So this is from some research from IWPR. And the main thing you can see is that Social Security is the most common source of retirement income for all Americans. 90% get Social Security income, looking at women. For pensions, only 29% of women have any pension income, and that includes their 401ks, their guaranteed pension amounts from a defined benefit plan, and their husband's pensions. That includes what you might get as a widow. So it's not very high. Assets, a lot of people do have assets, savings, a house, whatever, that they get some income from. That's more than half of all women. Earnings, 13% of older women are employed, and SSI, which is our poverty program, 4% of women. The figures for men are not that different, except that the pension income is substantially higher. About 45% of older men do receive pension income. So the main thing I want you to notice here is that the percent of Americans receiving income from pensions is small. So I think if you look at the U.S. retirement system as a whole, we have to conclude that Social Security is doing pretty well. It's providing money to a lot of people, and for most people, it's their highest source of income. The only source of income that is higher is earnings, but very few people are actually working in retirement. So discounting that, Social Security is the highest source of income. And of course, if we averaged it among all people, it would be the highest source of income. This just happens to show it separately for those who get that, who actually get that source. So Social Security is doing well. The rest of our pension system is entirely voluntary. You either save or don't. Your employer either gives you a pension or doesn't. And I think we have to conclude that the retirement system in America is broken. It is not working. We are sending into retirement, 70% of women with no pension and 50% of men with no pension. So that's not really a very good economic security system for old age. So I don't think the voluntary system has been working very well. People know they're not saving as much. This was a survey that the Rockefeller Foundation did that we analyzed for them, and it just shows that among all groups, pretty much, women are slightly more worried than men about their retirement. For example, 29% of women are worried about their economic security compared to 19% of men. This was also before the recession started. 51% of women report that their employers do have a retirement savings plan of some kind, 61% of men. There is some good news. For women who are working full-time and men who are working full-time, they both participate in retirement savings accounts at the same rate, which is about half. But women, because they earn less, are saving less in their retirement plans, and they have less accumulated in their 401ks. Most say they can't afford to save more for retirement. If they're retired, most of the women say Social Security is their primary income source, and the only group that about half or more says they are saving enough is college graduates. Everybody else says they are not, and they're also quite worried about the dangers to Social Security, that it might be cut back, and they're extremely nervous about that. And minorities are more worried, more nervous, and more concerned than whites. So I want to take a look now at why we got there. So now you can take a look at the little PowerPoint icon, how we got there. This is really more of an overview of what women and men have been doing in their working lives. And you can see my first illustrations, thanks to Ashley English, my research assistant, who always comes up with great photos. Boomer women, who are the women entering retirement now, as compared to the ones already in retirement, have worked twice as much as their moms, spent twice as much time in the labor market, twice as likely to work. They got a lot more education, and they even earned more. However, and this is the bad part when you think about your retirement security, they married less, they divorced more, they had fewer children. Well, that could be a good thing for your retirement security in that you didn't spend as much on your children. But then on the other hand, you have fewer people who might help you out. And they had more children outside marriage, which is going to not be good for your economic security. It's very expensive to raise children, and if you're doing it on your own, it's certainly going to cut into your ability to save for your retirement. The next slide, if we had a PowerPoint, imagine a PowerPoint. It shows that what's been happening, long-term trend to women's employment and men's employment. And men's employment has been falling over the long term. And I take that to be mainly a wealth effect. As our society has gotten wealthier, men can do more other things, spend more time in education, take some time off, retire earlier. Women have been catching up. They've been voting with their feet into the labor market. But you can see that since about 2000, the increase in women's labor force participation has pretty much leveled off. We could go into a lot of discussion about that, but basically I think with the education women have had, they've been catching up to men's education, even exceeding it in terms of college degrees, and they're moving into the labor force. I feel like they're moving into paid employment, voting with their feet. But the next chart will show you that one of the danger points for women in old age is that they've divorced more, and therefore they're going to be entering retirement perhaps without a husband and perhaps without ever having had a 10-year marriage. I see a number of young people in the audience. Does anyone know why having had a 10-year marriage is very important to women's retirement security or men's?
You get access to Social Security benefits.
From your spouse. Right, exactly. So anyone contemplating divorce should,
Stick it out. Stick it out.
separate if you must, move out of the house if you must, but do not make that document legal for 10 years if you can possibly hold off. Because, sad to say, this is still a major, major source of women's retirement income is income from their husbands. And I don't have in this one a graph of women's earnings because I think you're all very familiar with that. Still, for full-time, year-round women workers, women are earning only about 77% of what men earn. But over their lifetime, women, the typical woman in America today, over a 15-year period that we studied, earns, are you ready for this number? Only 38% of what the typical man earns over a 15-year period in primary age earning years, like 26 to 55. Why is that? Women are spending more time out of the labor market, taking care of kids and family, and when they do work, they're facing that 75%, that 25% penalty for being a woman. So over the lifetime, given that we still have a domestic division of labor in which women spend more time taking care of kids, when you hit retirement, that's going to come home to roost. If you hit retirement without that husband, you are not going to have a lot less money than if you were still married. So take a look at the last graph. This just shows us for today's retirees how they access Social Security. The pink batch on the bottom, these are the women who access Social Security only on their own earnings record. That hasn't changed in 40 years. It's about 40% of women who access Social Security on their own earnings record, meaning either they don't have access to a man's record or their earnings record is just as high as their husband's or higher. 30% are now duly entitled, meaning they could access it as a worker or as a spouse. And essentially what that means is that, especially when you're still married, if you're still married, your husband is still alive, your benefit is topped up to half of his. The spousal benefit is 50% of the other of your spouse. So your worker benefit was less than 50%, you get topped up to 50%. And 30% of women receive the benefits only as a spouse, meaning they didn't have a 10-year earnings record at all. And that, of course, is going to become increasingly less likely. About 95% of women in the future are going to enter the Social Security age with a 10-year earnings record. So, unfortunately, this really conveys that marriage is a very, very important part of women's retirement security because, as we know, Social Security is the biggest part of women's, especially retirement. And so the lack of marriage is a problem for them. What can we do about all of these things? Well, I'm not really into having the marriage promotion agency. I don't know if you remember that wonderful cartoon. It showed all the government buildings with names like Marriage License Bureau, Marriage Promotion, Dating Agency. This was during our marriage promotion years of the earlier welfare reform, so I'm not going to advocate that. But of course, anything that will strengthen and lengthen women's attachment to the labor market, anything that will increase their wages, will certainly help women. I think, too, here the loss of the defined pensions is very important to women because with defined pensions, there's a law that your husband cannot refuse to share his pension with you if you do not sign off on it. So before, does anybody know when that was passed? 1984. Right. So before 1984, a man is, let's say, retiring from his career at the DuPont chemical company, and he looks at his pension and he says, I can get $3,000 a month if I don't leave anything to my wife, or I can only get $2,500 a month if I leave something to my wife. And remember, before 1984, most wives had spent a good part of their careers raising children and not working. And 2/3 of men said, don't leave anything for the wife. I like that $3,000 a month figure. This is hard for me to believe, but it's true. We passed that law, and very quickly it goes down to 1/3 of men doing that. An amazing impact of that law. So wives have a particular right to a defined benefit plan. They have no right to an IRA or 401k at all, according to current law. So I think that's one thing we could fix. Look at how we might be able to do that with law. Another thing, of course, is spreading pensions, and there are several proposals in the works now. The Guaranteed Retirement Account, which you might be familiar with from Teresa Ghilarducci and the Economic Policy Institute, the Universal 401k, I'm not exactly sure who's pushing that, and the Auto IRA. The Universal 401k and the Auto IRA, especially the Auto IRA, is just a way to help workers save. If you have 10 or more employees, you would be required to give them an IRA that they could put money into. And of course, as an employer, you wouldn't have to do anything. There'd be a slight credit for you, and of course if you have a low income you would get a saver's credit for doing that. So there is each of these has a federal policy component. So a lot of people are pushing that because so few people are participating, right? Only half of full-time workers, so few people are entering retirement with any kind of pension other than Social Security, so we have to do something. Auto IRA is one idea. Universal 401k, I think that plan would involve some government match, and so it would cost the government something. And then the Guaranteed Retirement Account is really a plan to require, that's the only plan that would require employers to pay a universal amount. That's 2.5% employers would be required to pay. The worker would also be required to pay 2.5%, and there would be a federal tax credit so that low-income people wouldn't actually be losing disposable income. And the way we would pay for that in this plan is to take away the tax credits now for the current 401ks and IRAs. And the reason for doing that is that when you look at who holds those savings, it is mostly high-income people. So right now, all of our federal tax expenditures that aren't going towards Social Security, but that are going to private savings, IRAs, 401ks, almost all of them are going to high-income people. That's one of the reasons why high-income people save for retirement and low-income people don't. So how do we get low-income people to save? Well, with something like the Auto IRA, we can just make it easy for them. With something like the Universal 401k or the Guaranteed Retirement Account, we could make them do it. But really, the only way to redistribute income toward the low end is to redistribute income, i.e. take our tax expenditures and use them on low-income people rather than on high-income people, which is where we're using it now. Basically, because of these trends, because of the increase in women working, the increase in divorce, and the increase in non-marriage, for women, all that increased work effort is not going to pay off for them in retirement. They're going to be more hurt by the loss in marriage. So in the future, we'll see more poverty among older women if we don't do anything. And given the decline of defined benefit pensions, the decline of housing values, the decline of assets in 401ks and IRAs because of the stock market crunch, we may very well see more poverty among older men too. So I would say that this is a very urgent area for congressional action. We should be looking at ways to spread pensions, make them more secure. Only the guaranteed retirement account of those I mentioned really makes pensions more secure. What we have done with our pension system is shift risk from the employer to the worker and the worker's family members, and now we're seeing what can happen when we do that. So we definitely need to increase the spread of pensions. We need to increase the security of pensions. And if we move with something, I just want to make one comment before I'm sure I need to end, right? If we move to something like universal 401k or auto IRA, I'd like to see the same thing there that we're talking about with healthcare reform, a public option. Right now, there's no public option in these plans. But if one of the options the employer would have to make available to you is to put your savings in a public savings vehicle, something like the federal government's thrift savings plan, let the government invest it for you, I think that that would give workers a lot of confidence. You know, in the end, they're going to trust the government more than they're going to trust the financial services industry, especially now, I think. So I'd like to see a public option in these other two plans. I want to mention home equity, some home equity solutions. Dean Baker, one of the few economists who predicted the housing bubble, saw it coming, measured it every month. You could read it on his website, CEPR. I recommend it to you, CEPR, Center for Economic and Policy Research. Be sure you get the U.S. one, not the U.K. one. And he thinks that the Federal Reserve should have foreseen it and could have prevented it, and that we could have rules for our mortgage guarantee companies like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, to not guarantee amounts of home equity that are bubble amounts, that you would tie the amount you would guarantee of these loans to an index, and he would recommend an index based on monthly rental values, which tend to go up with income. They don't bubble the way the housing market does from speculation. So I think in the long run we could do something like that. Short run, we could have a better program to help homeowners who are hurt now with foreclosure crises, more cram down, more refinancing. I don't think we're doing enough there. And the final point, Social Security, having looked at home equity and pensions, let me turn and end with Social Security. I think it's very important that we not cut benefits for Social Security. None of the fixes that we should be talking about now should involve a benefit cut. If anything, we should be increasing benefits at the low end, because, as I said, we are very, very likely to see an increase in poverty among the elderly if we do nothing. So I think this is a true financial crisis for our elderly. It really is a triple whammy, and I really hope and pray that Congress will be able to make some changes in these areas to help not only our current retirees, but our future retirees. So thank you.
Thank you to both of our wonderful speakers. I'm sure you have many questions. Let's give priority to members of Congress and the staffers, the people on the Hill first, and please identify yourselves. Questions, and someone will give you a mic if you want to have a question.
Hill, I think in this very room, as a matter of fact, and they too addressed risk and the shifting of risk, and not only investment losses and inflation. They also identified biological factors such as longevity with the possibility of outliving retirement funds, as well as disability and catastrophic medical expenses. They also referred to educational risks such as a lack of financial literacy, and in particular longevity literacy. What are your? Do you agree that those are issues as well, and do you have any comments about them?
Yeah, I went over time as it was, so I didn't get to say that one of the reasons women are more at risk than men is, of course, that they live longer. And also, they spend more time alone. If you look at, say, 85-year-old men and women, more than half of 85-year-old men are actually married, whereas very few 85-year-old women are married. And in general, married couples have more resources, and so the poverty rate is much lower among married couples when they are elderly than singles. So women have a particular risk of outliving men and being alone. And there are some vehicles to deal with longevity, which are often called longevity insurance. I mean, one of the good things about the pension sign-off that you have to do that exists now since 1984 is that women get their share. With a 401k or an IRA, not only is there no requirement that you share it with your spouse, but there's no requirement that you turn it into an annuitized amount, that you get a guaranteed amount every year. And so if you spend at too high a rate and you live too long, you're going to be out of money. Whereas Social Security is essentially an annuity. You're going to get it every year as long as you live, and it requires you to give half of it to your spouse when you're living, and when you die, your spouse gets your whole amount. So, and divorced spouses are eligible if they've had a 10-year marriage. That's very important. Remember that. And so I do think that some requirements to forcing workers to turn their 401ks or IRAs, or at least a portion of them, into annuities, which the spouse has to be signed off on if she does not, or he does not get a share of it. Now, I will say that for higher-earning women, and by the way, nurses is one of the highest-earning female-dominated professions, in case people don't know. I have been in, many groups like this where some, I remember one nurse very well saying, "I don't want my husband to get his hands on my 401k." And I think for some married women, they see their own 401k as kind of like their security blanket. He doesn't know anything about investment. He's just going to mess it up. And so there are these, tensions within the marriage about who should be doing what. But I do think some requirement to share pension accumulations with the spouse and to turn it into something like a guaranteed annuity, and preferably inflation adjusted, would be very, very appropriate.
I just wanted to follow up with a comment about the staying married to at least 10 years. Tom Cruise divorced Nicole Kidman at 9 years, but I don't think Social Security had anything to do with it.
Yeah, back there.
Hi, Daniel Lamott. I'm with a retirement investment firm. I have a question regarding the net worth, the mean net worth. It seems sort of incredulous that the pre-boomers' net worth is almost $1 million, the mean, and for all the age group is $720,000. Is that how did you get these numbers? Because the figures that I would come with are much less than that.
Which table are you looking at?
Table 13.
Table 13.
Okay.
First of all, I didn't, there are a lot of qualifications I would have made had I had more time. One of them is that we used means here because we were trying to calculate ratios, and we couldn't do that if we were using medians. Normally speaking, I would not use mean net worth totals. These are right from the Survey of Consumer Finances, and these include housing. These include, essentially, they include all forms of wealth except for Social Security and defined benefit pensions. So the mean net worth figure for all of these cohorts is highly skewed by the top 10% of the population that has most of the nation's wealth. That's the reason why I wouldn't normally use it. I was trying to actually calculate some ratios, and the only way I could do that in a meaningful way was to use the mean as opposed to the median. But if I were to use medians, you would see a number that was closer to a couple of $100,000, not $800,000. So a more representative or a more typical household would probably, in fact, I didn't include it in the tables that I sent to the Wilson Center, but and apparently I haven't included it in mine either. But I thought I looked at those numbers before I came, and they are on the order of $250,000. That's much more likely. That's probably the number that you're familiar with, and that's the number that you ought to see most often because that's the more typical measure. That's the measure of a more typical household. So this has limitations in that I had to use means. I'm going to take another pass at this to try to get at, well, what we call them. It's a measure of the central tendency, but to take the mean of the middle 10% of the distribution, so you're not biasing your data by looking at those with the highest wealth. And so that's a good point. It doesn't reflect. And let me say this: if I were to do something that I wouldn't do on paper, but to calculate a median and then take the median amount that people took out in the form of home equity, it's not legit to do it, but you would get something more on the order of an extraction of 10%. That people lost 10% of their net worth, I should say, rather than what I'm saying here is 1%. So it is affected by that, by having to use the mean for the distribution.
Did you have a question?
Thank you. Kathy Hurwitz with Congresswoman Schakowsky. Heidi, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on what I expect we're all going to see here on the Hill, and that is an outflow of people upset about the Social Security COLA not going up next year, and what that means to retirement security, given the importance of Social Security, and whether there's anything we can do to address that.
Well, I know it's dead on Capitol Hill, according to, was it Norm Ornstein, whom I heard on the radio this morning? But I think a second stimulus package, or maybe we would just call it an aid package, to increase unemployment benefits, because I think the end of those is this December, right? The extended benefits, food stamp relief, and another rebate for Social Security recipients is going to be very important. I know my mom got $250 this year, and I think last year from George Bush she got $400. So it would be great, I think, to do something like that, because one of the other things is not only is their COLA not going to increase, but their drug premium benefits very well could increase. So they're actually going to get a smaller take-home. Because if they're paying, the retired are paying premiums, most of them, and for parts of Medicare. So they'll actually have a smaller net take-home if Congress and the administration don't act. Do you have any other proposals besides just a nice rebate?
I don't know. Some of us talked about the problem is obviously finding the money to do it, but a temporary increase in benefits, something to help, because the cost of necessities are going to go up.
Right.
And I think a lot of people, particularly older women who rely on Social Security for all of their income, are going to really be hit. So I expect we're going to see come next fall a lot of attention to this.
Right. When we were talking about this recently, when is that cost of living determined? Is it August of every year? The 12 months? Yeah. And of course, since the 6 months ending in March, April, May, there's a decline in the CPI for the second half of the last 12 months. And so depending on how far that goes, we may very well see a zero COLA.
The other thing is some people, people will be hit. There's no protection for Part D premium increases, but some people will be hit from Part B increases as well. So that'll be a double whammy.
I'm hoping that there's no negative COLA in Social Security. Does anybody know? That's outlawed, right?
Can't be done.
Yeah. Well, good.
This woman here, down front.
Marjorie Lightman Rye. Hello, Heidi. I'm just curious, does anyone know if men save differently if they're married? Is there a marriage effect on men in terms of how they save?
Well, there's definitely a difference between couples and singles. I mean, married couples save more than single people do, men or women. And across the board, I mean, if you look at single individuals, female single individuals, women save less than men save less than couples, regardless of whether they have children or not. So, and let me say, when I say save, I mean they have net worth. When you look at how much they have in terms of net worth, there's no question that couples are better off than singles.
And single mothers save the least of all, not too surprisingly, because their income is so tight. But I do believe married people save more at similar income levels.
But single women save the least.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any statistics on domestic partners? I mean, is it possible to get any data on that? Oh, your saving rates?
Probably could get some. I would contact Lee Badgett at UMass Amherst, see what she has on that. The economist who studies gay and lesbian partners and their economic status a lot. And she also does, by the way, lots of reports state by state on the benefits to the marriage industry if gay marriage is legalized. You know, more floral sales, more rentals, celebrations, travel, a lot of travel, tourist travel to the states that legalize it. It was a big effect in California, short-lived there. And, you know, she says, talking with her friends in the movement, none of them ever want to really talk about this as the reason for marriage. They want it to be rights-based. But she says, gosh, do the media love to write about how the marriage industry is going to rake it in.
Just along those lines, Heidi, I wonder if you would agree that, I mean, you were talking about the negative benefits of the negative aspects of IRAs and that spouses don't necessarily get a share of them. But for domestic partners, it is actually a way for them to share in old age in pension benefits because the holder of an IRA can assign it to anyone they want. Is that
Sure.
right?
Right.
So, although it
Right.
may be taxed, I guess.
Right,
There's no-
right.
yeah.
One of the things I loved about the privatization of Social Security debate was that one of the guys who was really the originator of the idea of, you know, private individual accounts, I was debating him once, and I said, and he's a real, you know, what do we call those people? Libertarians, free market type. And he said, when asked the question, the only time we got one of them to say it on air, so really, with your proposal, a guy could take his individual retirement account and leave it to his girlfriend instead of his wife, right? And he said, yes, that's right. That's correct. So most of them would not admit that, but he did, so.
Or his dog.
Yeah, or his dog or cat, right?
Yeah, over here.
I can't see both speakers, but the
Identify
thing.
yourself, please.
Oh, Bob Drago from the Joint Economic Committee. I'm concerned about the 401k in that it is pro-cyclical. So when things get bad, my 401k lost 50% of its value because I'm not a good investor. But additionally, firms have announced a quarter of all employers are cutting their or have eliminated contributions to 401k at exactly the time when people are most dependent on them. And I was wondering, you know, if either of you had ideas about how to deal with that.
Not really. I mean, I don't. But, I mean, basically the system we have is voluntary. The one good thing I saw was that, you know, there is that mandatory requirement to take money out at age 70 and a half. And I think part of the stimulus package took that away. And I think it might be good to leave that on for a while. In other words, for those who can afford it, who don't need to withdraw money, there's no point in forcing them to withdraw money when their assets are low in value. That's a very minor fix for very well-off people, but, you know, it's valuable nonetheless. John, do you have some ideas of what we can do about declining 401k values?
No, I don't. But I was just going to say that. I mean, this is of no. This doesn't help the individual saver, but you know, from the standpoint of the economy, of course, we don't want people to be saving too much right now. We want them to be spending more. That's not a good reason to not to match people's 401k contributions. But it's just funny that, you know, we're really worried about saving, and at the same time, what's really the problem that we have is that people are not consuming enough. So we have a short-term and a long-term problem. The saving is really a long-term problem, and I guess what we hope it. I mean, you know, AARP made national news when it discontinued its 401k match sometime earlier this year. The funny thing to me was that when it made National Public Radio, and they asked one of our representatives about it, he didn't point out that we have a defined benefit plan at AARP, which was a huge fallback for anybody who had the 401k plan. So, you know, I mean, the luckiest people, of course, are the ones who have both, but they're few and far between. But as far as, you know, what to do about salvaging those losses, I mean, I don't have any great solutions.
Well, just add the Teresa Ghilarducci solution in the guaranteed retirement account is to stop incentivizing those 401k and IRA plans, and to put the tax money in a guaranteed retirement account, which would have at least a 3% rate of return guaranteed by the federal government through something like a thrift savings plan, and would require an employer match. So I do believe we should move our tax expenditures in that direction, but that's going to be a hard struggle on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I think that's a point that's worth underscoring, because there have actually been some studies done, and I don't know if the conventional wisdom is still that the tax subsidies exceed the amount that people actually save, but there have been a couple of reports that have suggested that the tax subsidies are essentially just a waste, which is one of the reasons why Teresa has proposed using the elimination of those subsidies to finance mandatory contributions, mandatory on employers and individuals, because the subsidy basically goes to people who would save anyway. And so, but the problem is that employers love 401k plans relative to DB plans because they're off the hook as far as responsibility for paying out. But the thing that's really anomalous is that individuals like 401k plans, and when you pose to them the option of whether they'd like a defined benefit or a defined contribution plan, and you describe as best you can in a survey what those plans are like, they often choose the 401k plan in preference to a defined benefit plan. And I think most experts would tell you that that's not a choice in their own interest, but there are things about the 401k plan that people like so well, namely that they get to see their annual balances, and they can and they feel like they have some control over it, which is true, but they have very little control over it, and they also it makes them feel good, and because it's money that they think is theirs. Of course, it's only on paper, which we have all been reminded of in the last couple of years. But at any rate, that's one of the problems, is that people will actually choose in many cases for the 401k, which is probably less advantageous for their their long-term security, especially if they're going to be in a single job for a number of years. If you're jumping from job to job, then a defined benefit plan isn't going to be of much value.
Do those surveys change over time? If you did one a few years ago, might it not be different from if you did it today?
Well, there haven't been that many. They basically said the same thing that in the ones that I've seen, the 401k system hasn't been around all that long, and so we don't have any surveys going back very far.
All right.
I'm Catherine Rutter, School of Public Policy, George Mason University. I was wondering, has anybody begun to study the impact on younger generations of the downturn? You mentioned, John, that the post-boomers took out the most money of their houses. Did I read that right? But further, stopping 401k plans temporarily, what does that mean for the magic, the sort of the magic of compounding? If it's just going into some equivalent of a small investment account, what does it mean that those years are missing for the retirement security of the cohort of the people in this room? Maybe not the people in this room, but their cohort.
Well, it's really bad in terms of compounding, but it's much better, at least, that it's happening to them now rather than at age 55 or 60. So, if that's your question, they're losing a lot by losing the capacity to compound. And I don't know that. The only study that I've seen that's remotely close to what you're suggesting is Jack Vanderhei at Ebury. They have this huge database of 401k holders, like 1 million workers, and they look at the effect on savings in 401ks by it is by age, but it's also by tenure. And I guess the good news is that the losses were smallest among younger workers, partly because they had less to lose. They had less accumulation, so they couldn't lose as much. And they probably didn't have as much at risk in terms of equities that older workers did. And so they reached the conclusion, Jack reached the conclusion that the biggest losses were suffered by people who were in their 55 to 64, who had been with the same employer for like 15 or 20 years. They took a huge hit, but that hit diminished with shorter tenure and younger age. So it's not they have more time to recover, I guess, is what is the best thing you can say about it.
This will have to be the last question. Yeah, over here.
I'm Frank Tedesco with the American Academy of Actuaries. A follow-up comment on the spouse's benefit that's required as a default for defined benefit plans, and the possibility of extending that to the defined contribution world. In addition to the existence of that benefit, the possible spread of that benefit, another issue is what should the level of that benefit be? Right now it's 50% as the defined benefit default. And studies have shown that the cost of living for a single person is more than 50% that of a couple, because there are economies of scale of two people living together. So that's a consideration we should remember as well.
Right.
Two can live as cheaply as one. Right.
I should point out that in Social Security, it's actually essentially 2/3. A married couple, let's say, where the woman is using the spousal benefit, is going to get 100% of the man's benefit and 50% of the man's benefit for her. So that's 150% of his benefit. When he dies, she'll have to give up her own, but she'll get 100% of his. So that's essentially a 2/3 guaranteed amount for the wife, rather than the 50%, which is common in the defined benefit. And yes, we really definitely should increase that. One of the things that we see in retirement is that married couples are not poor and single people are. So anything we can do to shift the benefits from the period of time when the couple is married to the period of time when only one is left, usually the woman, the better off we are at reducing poverty. Now, marriage for single women doesn't do anything. And there, I like to say we ought to have a dating benefit. If you dated enough, you get some share of the pension.
Well, on that note, thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you all for coming. Please grab some